"You dirty liar." The words slammed across the hearing room like a gavel in a death sentence. Donald Trump's voice carried the venom of a man used to winning by humiliation. But what made the moment electric wasn't just the insult, it was who he said it to. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her gaze locked on him. Cameras caught every microsecond, beaming it into millions of homes. In America today, where 72% of veterans report feeling abandoned by the very government they served, and over 40% of minorities say they've been silenced in public forums, this was more than political theater. It was a collision between power and truth, broadcast live. And in just 33 seconds, the man who thought he owned the room was about to lose it. The marble hearing room wasn't ready for what came next. Every polished column seemed to stand taller, as if bracing for impact. The faint hum of the overhead lights merged with the sound of shifting bodies. Journalists leaning forward, aides whispering into phones, veterans tightening their folded caps in their laps. Donald Trump gripped the microphone like a weapon. His knuckles whitened against the silver stem, the veins on the back of his hand rising like cables under strain. When he spoke, it was not with the cadence of discussion. It was an ambush. "This woman is a traitor to the United States. Arrest her. Now!" The syllables hit like shrapnel. They didn't just travel through the speakers. They detonated in the air, scattering gasps and murmurs through the chamber. It was the political equivalent of pulling the pin on a grenade in a room where everyone knew they were in the blast radius. His loyalists erupted instantly, roaring like a stadium crowd tasting blood. Fists pumped in the back row. The chant began, rhythmic and raw. "Lock her up, lock her up." The sound bounced off the marble, feeding on itself until it became less chant, more war drum. On the other side of the aisle, faces hardened. Decorated veterans in crisp uniforms did not stand, did not clap. Their jaws tightened, their eyes narrowing into razor slits. Minority rights advocates leaned forward in their seats, lips pressed white, the insult carving deeper than policy ever could. And in the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett did not move. Not an eyelash, not a breath. It was the stillness of a statue carved for battle. The kind of stillness that is not emptiness, but coiled strength. Cameras swiveled toward her, their red tally lights blinking like the eyes of predators, ready to broadcast her reaction, or lack of one, to millions. Viewers in farmhouses in Iowa, in cramped apartments in Brooklyn, in coffee shops in Phoenix, all leaned closer to their screens. They weren't just watching a hearing, they were watching to see if she'd shatter. Trump leaned forward, the corners of his mouth curling in a predator's grin. He believed he had seized the room, bent it to his will. His voice swelled again, feeding the crowd's fever. "You hear me? Arrest her now!" The chant swelled in reply. "Lock her up! Lock her up!" As though the walls themselves had been enlisted in the attack. But Jasmine, still nothing. No flinch, no glare. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like surrender. But to those who'd been in fights where timing meant survival, it was clear. She was letting the noise burn itself out, letting him talk himself into the trap. The committee clerk glanced sideways at her, sensing something in the air shift. In front of her, the slim black envelope rested like a secret with a pulse. Her fingertips brushed it once, barely perceptible. In the control booth at the back, a technician's hand hovered over a single switch, the one that could wake the massive monitor behind the dais. His eyes met hers for half a beat. She gave the faintest nod. But not yet. The veterans in the front row shifted, their instincts, honed in places where the wrong move could mean death, telling them they were moments away from something they would never forget. The roar of the crowd pressed in like heat from a furnace. The smell of sweat and tension thickened the air. Trump sat back slightly, basking in what he thought was submission. His fingers tapped the mic stand with a lazy rhythm. "Cat got your tongue?" he goaded, earning another round of laughter from his corner. The chuckles rang shallow, but he didn't hear it. Jasmine's eyes stayed locked on his, unblinking, like a marksman with the scope already aligned, just waiting for the perfect breath to pull the trigger. Seconds stretched unnaturally. The audience's adrenaline had nowhere to go. News anchors in glass booths across the country spoke in hushed tones, afraid to break whatever was unfolding. This wasn't silence. It was sharpening. In Ohio, a retired steelworker gripped his mug so tight his knuckles whitened. In Texas, a veteran leaned forward in his recliner, metals glinting faintly as the chant echoed from his television. Everyone was waiting for the same thing: her move. Trump smiled wider, convinced he'd frozen her out. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't frozen. She was calculating, and the calculation was almost complete. Her hand, steady as a surgeon's, slid toward the black envelope again. This time her fingers closed around it. She didn't look down. She didn't break the stare. The crowd's roar faltered for just a heartbeat, the human instinct to notice when prey decides it's done running. In that single beat, the balance in the room tilted. Not enough for the untrained to name, but enough that every veteran in the front row straightened, sensing the pivot. And in the back, the technician's thumb rested fully on the switch, waiting for the moment her eyes would say now. But the moment didn't come. Not yet. She let the pause stretch like a bowstring pulled to its limit, each heartbeat tightening the tension until the air itself felt like it might snap. Trump thought the silence was his, that he had her pinned under the weight of his words. But the truth? She was stalking him, the way a predator circles in tall grass, quiet enough to make the prey believe it's safe. In living rooms across America, the quiet was deafening. A Vietnam vet in Ohio leaned forward in his recliner, elbows on his knees, the glow of the TV painting his face in pale blue. In Florida, a retired nurse reached for the volume, not to turn it down, but to make sure she could hear every breath, every shift of fabric, every clue to what was coming. They knew this look, the stillness before the strike, the kind that made your skin prickle because you could feel the danger before you could see it. Trump mistook it for hesitation. He had no idea she was loading her first round. The air in the chamber changed. The chants from the back row lost their rhythm, a few voices faltering without knowing why. Every camera lens leaned into her. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to sync with hers. Jasmine Crockett did not blink, did not twitch, did not give him the satisfaction of a single wasted motion. It was a silence sharpened to a blade's edge, and she was the one holding the hilt. Trump smirked, mistaking patience for weakness. He rolled his shoulders, leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "Cat got your tongue?" The loyalist chuckled, but the sound was thin, like a match struggling in the wind. She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because the longer she stayed silent, the more he filled the air with his own rope. The committee clerk caught it first, the subtle curl of her fingers around the black envelope. In the back, the technician straightened, eyes locked on hers, muscles coiled to act the second he saw it. Still, nothing. She was making the world wait. Trump's voice grew louder, his insults sharper, each one thrown like a dart that missed by inches. "She's a puppet. Without the media, she's nothing." He leaned back as though he'd scored the point, and that was when the corners of her mouth lifted. Not into a smile, but into the faint, knowing expression of someone who sees the checkmate before the opponent even realizes the game is over. In the gallery, veterans began shifting in their seats, that deep-seated instinct telling them the first shot was about to be fired. And somewhere in America, in small kitchens, in crowded bars, in the quiet glow of late-night TV, people leaned closer, holding their breath. Then at last it happened. Jasmine's eyes shifted, just a fraction, but it was enough. The technician's thumb dropped. The monitor flared to life, casting a cold, unforgiving light across the chamber. The chant died in an instant. The predator had stepped into the clearing, and now everyone could feel it. That subtle, almost primal shift in the air, the way a forest goes quiet before something lethal moves. Her right hand slid, slow, deliberate, toward a slim black envelope on the desk. It wasn't a dramatic grab, no flourish, no shaking fingers. Just the measured control of someone who knew the exact weight of the moment. The clerk's eyes flicked to it. A technician's finger hovered over the switch in the back of the room. The gallery leaned forward without realizing it, pulled in by the invisible gravity of what was about to happen. Trump kept talking. His voice rose and fell like a man building his own fortress. Brick by brick, convinced that the higher he stacked it, the safer he'd be. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that every brick he laid was another wall closing in on him. She's a disgrace to this committee. She's a disgrace to this country, he barked, stabbing the air with his finger. The words echoed, but the echo no longer landed with the same force. The power in the room was shifting, slowly, like a tide, away from the noise toward the stillness. Jasmine's fingertips reached the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't even glance down. The move was so quiet, so understated, that it would have gone unnoticed if not for the way the clerk's spine stiffened, or the way the technician's thumb twitched ever so slightly closer to the switch. Trump leaned back in his chair, mistaking her calm for a retreat. The smug curve of his mouth deepened as he scanned the room, seeing only his supporters. Not the veterans in the front row leaning forward, not the minority advocates exchanging tight, knowing looks, not the growing number of eyes locked on the black envelope like it was a live wire. In living rooms across the country, people could feel the tension without knowing why. A truck driver in Oklahoma pulled over to the side of the highway just to watch, engine idling, hazard lights blinking against the asphalt. A teacher in Chicago stood frozen in her kitchen doorway, a mug of coffee cooling in her hands. Something was coming. Jasmine's thumb traced the edge of the envelope, like a musician feeling for the first note of a song they've rehearsed 1,000 times. Trump kept talking. Without the cameras, she wouldn't even be here. She's nothing but a headline waiting to be forgotten. His allies laughed, but the sound rang thin, a hollow echo in a room where the focus was no longer his. The technician glanced at the clerk. The clerk glanced at Jasmine. A single nod passed between them, almost imperceptible. But Jasmine didn't move yet. She let him keep going, let him believe he was still in control. Because the longer he spoke, the sweeter the silence would be when she broke it. In the second row, a young woman live streaming on her phone whispered to the screen, "She's setting him up. Watch her eyes." Her comment feed exploded in agreement. Across the country, hashtags began appearing in real time. Your black envelope, Russian Crockett vs. Trump, Honeynos treason or truth. The online world was catching up to the room, ready to explode the second the contents were revealed. Trump leaned forward again, gripping the mic with both hands. This is the problem with people like her. They pretend to care about this country, but they're just here to destroy it from the inside. Every word was another layer of rope tightening around him. Jasmine sat still, the envelope now resting beneath her palm like a weapon she didn't need to rush to draw. The clerk's hand hovered above the desk, waiting for her signal. The technician's finger grazed the switch. And then, finally, she moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even fast. She simply lifted the envelope, slid it across the desk to the clerk, and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes never left Trump's. The clerk opened the envelope with the care of someone defusing a bomb. A stack of documents slid into his hands, the paper crisp, edges perfectly square. He read the first page, and his eyes widened just enough for the veterans in the front row to notice. Without hesitation, he passed them to the technician. The technician placed the first page under the camera feed. The massive monitor behind the dais lit up, casting a pale glow over every face in the room. Even Trump turned to look. On the screen, a single line of text, in bold black type, an internal memo, dated, signed, and stamped with a seal that no one could claim was forged. It detailed a financial transfer, redirecting millions of dollars meant for veterans' health care into private accounts linked to foreign contractors. The date matched a week when VA hospitals reported running out of critical supplies. The room inhaled all at once. Gasps, shifts in seats, a binder thudding onto the desk. In the front row, a veteran's jaw tightened until his teeth ground audibly. In Montana, the widow in her living room whispered, "They stole from our vets." Trump's head snapped toward the monitor. "Fake, completely fake," he barked, but the sharpness in his tone carried an edge of panic that no microphone could hide. The camera zoomed in on his face, catching the faint glisten of sweat at his temple. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The documents were speaking for her, and the room was listening. But she wasn't finished, not even close. The giant monitor behind the dais flickered from black to blue. The glow rolled over the marble walls, over every face in the gallery, until the entire chamber was bathed in its cold, unforgiving light. A voice, his voice, spilled into the room. "If we give them the policy shift they want, They'll take care of us. Sanctions don't matter if the payoff's big enough. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight of it crushed the oxygen out of the room. Gasps ricocheted off marble. Veterans in the front row clenched their fists so tightly the fabric of their dress uniforms strained at the seams. One man's jaw worked slowly, like he was holding back words that could level the building. In a Detroit kitchen, a single mom whispered, "Oh my God," her hands frozen mid-reach for a coffee mug. On the second row, a young woman live streaming on her phone clapped a hand over her mouth. The comment feed exploded in real time. "That's his voice. Tell me this is fake. If this is real, he's done." Trump's eyes narrowed. His posture shifted in the subtle way a fighter does when they take an unexpected hit. "Fake. Completely fake," he barked into the mic, but the edges of his voice betrayed something rare in him. Urgency. The camera zoomed tighter on his face. Every twitch was captured in brutal clarity. The tightening jaw, the flicker of his eyes toward his lawyers, the faint glisten at his temple. Jasmine didn't look at him. She kept her gaze fixed forward, as if she were listening to the voice of a ghost. In the gallery, a veteran who had been sitting ramrod straight finally leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, his stare locked on the monitor. Beside him, another vet shook his head slowly. His lips moved, but no sound came. The audio continued, another man's voice muffled but clear. "Even with the sanctions?" Trump's reply, sharp and almost amused. "Sanctions don't matter if the payoff is big enough." The words hung there like smoke after a gunshot. Impossible to unhear, impossible to explain away. In Phoenix, a retired nurse on her lunch break turned the volume on her phone all the way up. In a truck stop in Kansas, 3 drivers huddled over a single tablet, their fries growing cold on the counter. Everywhere the reaction was the same. Silence first, then the slow, rising burn of outrage. Jasmine let the recording play without interruption. No commentary, no grandstanding. She understood the truth didn't need her to shout over it. It only needed space to breathe. And burn. Trump shifted again. His fingers tapped the table in a quick, uneven rhythm. The kind of rhythm you hear when someone's trying not to show they're rattled. "It's edited, spliced, out of context," he shot back, his volume climbing like a man trying to drown out the sound of his own voice on the tape. But the tide was already moving against him. A few Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting anywhere but toward the massive screen. One stared at the floor, another pretended to check his notes, though his pen hadn't touched paper in minutes. Jasmine finally moved. She leaned toward her microphone, her voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "If telling the truth is treason, perhaps the definition needs rewriting." It was a surgical strike, not a roar, a scalpel. The words landed so cleanly that for a second no one spoke. Not the loyalists in the back, not the veterans in the front. And in that suspended moment, the weight of what had just been heard settled like lead in the chest of everyone in the room. Trump opened his mouth as if to fire back, but for the first time in the hearing, he didn't find his words fast enough. The monitor kept glowing behind them, the frozen waveform of his voice on the screen like a crime scene photo. Somewhere deep in the crowd, a single voice whispered, not loud enough to carry, but the sentiment was universal. "She's got him." In Houston, a retired Marine reached for the remote, his thumb hovering over the power button, but he couldn't bring himself to switch it off. In Montana, the widow sat back in her chair, hands still resting on that folded flag. The truth had just walked into the room, and everyone knew it. Jasmine didn't lean back, didn't smile, didn't take her eyes off him. Because she knew, and now so did everyone else, this was just the first strike. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. "If telling the truth is treason, perhaps the definition needs rewriting." The sentence was surgical, no wasted syllables, no flourish. The kind of statement that doesn't just land, it lodges. It was the difference between swinging wildly and pressing a blade into the exact place you know will make your opponent bleed. Her tone was steady, almost too calm for the storm raging around her. But the calm was the point, because in a room full of shouting men, calm becomes dangerous. The words hit the loyalists in the back row first. Some shifted in their seats, a few trying to chuckle it off, but the laughter came out thin, like paper trying to cover a crack in concrete. On the Republican side of the dais, 2 members exchanged glances they thought no one could see. One swallowed hard. The other tapped his pen against the desk, eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, as if refusing to look made the truth less real. Trump sat frozen for half a beat, processing the fact that she had cut him without raising her volume. Then, like a man stung, he went on the attack again. Fake. All of it fake. You people are too blind to see it. But something in his delivery had changed. The booming certainty that usually carried his voice had frayed at the edges. Every denial sounded more like a defense than a verdict. The cameras caught everything. The tightening around his eyes, the quick glance toward his legal team, the subtle but unmistakable lean away from the glowing monitor behind him. In the front row, the veterans were no longer just watching. They were judging. One man's lips pressed into a hard white line. Another, younger, shook his head slowly, not in disbelief but in disgust. Jasmine stayed perfectly still, her hands folded loosely on the table, her gaze fixed on him with the patience of a hunter who knows the prey is tiring. She didn't rush, didn't fill the silence. Instead, she let it grow. Let it become something heavy enough to press down on the room until every eye, every camera, every heartbeat was locked on the space between the two of them. On a split-screen broadcast, viewers at home saw it clearly. Trump flailing in his seat, words spilling faster, his voice rising in pitch. Jasmine motionless, eyes level, expression unreadable. It was a study in contrast, and one of them was losing ground. In Houston, a retired Marine leaned forward in his armchair, a slow grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. In Seattle, a grandmother muted her TV so she could replay the moment on her tablet. She whispered to herself, "That's how you handle a bully." Trump jabbed his finger at her again, as though the physical gesture might puncture her composure. "She's not even qualified to be here. She's a puppet for radicals who hate this country." The loyalists in the gallery shouted their approval, but the applause felt out of step, like clapping in the wrong part of a song. Jasmine tilted her head, just enough to signal that she had heard him, just enough to acknowledge the attack without giving it weight. Then she turned a page in her stack of documents, slowly, deliberately, the sound of the paper crisp in the mic. The camera zoomed in on her hands. Viewers could see the steady rhythm, the absence of even the slightest tremor. On social media, the clip began circulating before the hearing was even over. The page turns started trending within minutes. Trump's voice sharpened. "Without the media, you'd be nothing." The irony was almost too rich for those watching at home. He was the one filling every broadcast with her image. He was the one ensuring her calm would be replayed on a loop. Jasmine looked up, not fast, not dramatically, just enough to catch his eyes and hold them. "Are you finished?" The room went still. Even the air seemed to pause. It wasn't said in anger. It wasn't said in fear. It was said like a judge to a witness who had already overplayed their hand. On cable news, the anchor's voice dropped to a hush. "That is control," she murmured over the live feed. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but no words came right away. And that fraction of a second, that hesitation, was all it took for the shift to become permanent. Jasmine lowered her gaze back to her papers, as though the exchange had been nothing more than a minor interruption to her work. The point was made. The blade was already in. Now all she had to do was twist. Another folder slid across her desk. No theatrics, no sudden lunge for attention. Just the steady, deliberate motion of a woman who knew the next blow would land harder than the first. The clerk's hand hesitated for only a second before taking it. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The weight of the folder told him enough. He opened it. Emails, cold, clinical, orders to gut veterans' healthcare budgets, redirecting millions into private deals with contractors who had nothing to do with medical care. The language on the page was surgical in its cruelty. No emotion, no hesitation, only numbers, authorizations, and signatures. The date stamps told their own story. They lined up perfectly with the weeks VA hospitals had reported running out of essential supplies. Oxygen tanks, wheelchairs, prosthetics, even basic medication. In black and white, the betrayal was there for all to see. In Montana, a widow stopped folding laundry. Her hands trembled over the flag in its glass case, the one that had been handed to her at her husband's funeral. She didn't need to read the documents to understand their weight. In the front row, a veteran's face hardened. His knuckles whitened around the brim of his folded cap until his hands shook. Beside him, a younger soldier stared at the monitor with eyes that looked both furious and hollow, as though watching the very trust he'd fought for disintegrate in public. The technician projected the emails onto the massive screen. The font was plain, almost insultingly so. Subject lines read like corporate memos, not like the dismantling of a promise to those who had bled for the country. Reallocate unused VA healthcare funds to alternative investment opportunities. Shift remaining Q4 medical budget to project portfolio expansion. There was no pretense, no disguise, just greed with a timestamp. A murmur ran through the gallery. Not outrage, not yet. The kind of murmur that comes from people piecing together the scope of something monstrous, realizing how deep the roots go. Trump leaned toward his mic. This is out of context, completely out of context. But his voice cracked, just slightly, on the repetition. The cameras caught it. The networks replayed it instantly. Jasmine didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the screen, letting the silence and the damning words do the work. Because she knew every second that passed was another nail in the coffin. In a kitchen in Philadelphia, a retired Marine muttered at the TV, "Don't you dare talk context to me." In a hospital break room in Dallas, two nurses stopped mid-conversation, staring at the screen with the kind of stillness that comes when anger locks you in place. The clerk flipped to the next page. A follow-up email. Confirmed, redirection complete. Expect deposit within 3 business days. Attached were the routing numbers, the account names, the amounts. 7 figures. Enough to overhaul entire hospital wings. The air in the chamber thickened. The veterans in the front row weren't blinking. In the back, aides from both parties stopped whispering to one another, their eyes glued to the words that now glowed across the wall like a confession written in neon. Trump tried again, jabbing a finger toward the screen. "You're twisting this. This is business. It has nothing to do with—" He didn't finish, because Jasmine finally turned to face him. She didn't raise her voice. Those funds were promised to the men and women who serve this country. Instead, they were funneled into private ventures. You can call that whatever you want. I call it betrayal. The word landed like a gavel strike. Final, irrefutable. It rippled through the room, settling heavy in every corner. In Houston, a veteran sitting alone at his kitchen table whispered it out loud, as if testing how it felt in his mouth. Betrayal. In Los Angeles, a group of community organizers watching together murmured in unison. In Montana, the widow didn't speak at all. She just sat down, the folded flag still in her lap, and stared at the television. The murmurs in the chamber built into something more. A low, growing sound like a wave beginning to crest. The kind of sound that doesn't stop once it starts. Jasmine sat back slightly, her posture relaxed, as though she had simply placed one more piece in a puzzle she'd been assembling all day. She knew the picture was almost complete. Trump's face was tight now, his mouth drawn into a line, his eyes scanning the dais for a friendly face. He didn't find one. And as the monitor kept glowing with the evidence, the sense in the room shifted. It wasn't just that the tide was turning, it was that everyone could feel. He was standing on sand, and it was sliding out from under him. Jasmine turned to the gallery. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "Mr. Caleb Morton." Heads turned in unison, the way they do when a single name cuts through the noise like a bell tolling in a quiet town. A tall man in a gray suit stood slowly, as if he'd been waiting years for this exact moment. He reached up, gripped the edge of a plain black mask, and pulled it down in one smooth motion. Gasps shivered through the gallery. Caleb Morton, former senior security advisor to Donald J. Trump. A man who had vanished from Washington's radar after a sudden, unexplained resignation. And now he was here, in this room, looking directly at the man he once served. His voice was even, not loud, not hurried, but it carried. "I was in the room. I heard the calls. I saw the signatures. Everything you've seen is real, and there's worse." The room didn't breathe. The kind of silence that fell wasn't polite or procedural. It was the sound of oxygen being sucked out of a space by the weight of a single truth. Trump's smirk faltered for the first time. It didn't disappear entirely, but it cracked, like a mask that had just been dropped onto concrete. From the back, journalists rose from their seats, fumbling for phones and cameras. One reporter mouthed, "Oh my God," to another without looking away from Morton. In the front row, A veteran sat straighter, his eyes locked on the man in the gray suit, like he was taking mental measure of someone about to walk into enemy fire. Trump leaned forward into his mic. He's lying. He's nothing but a disgruntled ex-employee who wanted a bigger title. But the words came too quickly, too sharp-edged, as if he needed them out before the air solidified against him. Morton didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even glance at Trump while he spoke. Instead, he walked forward. Measured steps. No rush, no hesitation. The sound of his shoes against the marble floor echoed in the chamber. Each step seemed to mark the distance between who Trump thought he was and what was about to happen. He stopped at the witness table, adjusted the mic, leveled his gaze on the committee, and only then finally let his eyes flick toward Trump. For 3 years, I was in the room for his calls. I was there for his meetings. I read the contracts he signed. I watched the orders go out. He reached into his suit jacket and placed a small stack of documents on the table. The clerk took them, hands steady but eyes wide. Morton's voice didn't waver. These are records, memos, and transcripts, all directly tied to the decisions that redirected veterans' healthcare funds into private accounts connected to sanctioned foreign entities. He approved every one of them, and I will swear to it under oath. The words hung in the air like a flare over a battlefield, illuminating everything that had been hidden. In the gallery, the murmurs began, not the restless shuffle of a bored audience, but the low, dangerous hum of people realizing the story was bigger than they thought. Trump leaned back, his eyes darting to the Republicans on the dais, searching for an anchor. One stared at the floor, another rubbed his temple like he could erase what he'd just heard. Morton slid a single page across to the clerk. This one, he said, is a direct instruction to halt procurement of prosthetics for wounded veterans, so that the budget could be repurposed for a commercial property deal overseas. The words "halt procurement of prosthetics" burned into the room. On the big screen, the email appeared. Plain language, plain font, impossible to misinterpret. In the front row, the veteran with the white-knuckled cap lowered his head, his shoulders tight as stone. Beside him, another muttered under his breath, too quiet for the mics to catch, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. That's blood money. Trump's voice cut in, louder now, as if sheer volume could erase the ink on the page. This is nothing but a smear job. He's bitter. He's making this up as he goes. Morton didn't even turn his head. Every document I've brought has been verified by independent analysts. Every page matches internal White House logs. You can deny my presence, but you cannot deny my records. The quiet that followed was the kind that forces people to reckon with what they've just heard. It was the quiet of a blade being unsheathed in a locked room. In a diner in Kentucky, a group of veterans who'd been watching on the wall-mounted TV stopped eating. One of them took off his cap and set it on the table. In a Bronx apartment, a young man live streaming the hearing whispered to his chat, "If this is true, it's game over." Morton sat back slightly, his job done for now, the document speaking louder than any crossfire could. And Jasmine? She didn't thank him, didn't nod, didn't break her focus from the man across the room. Because this was the second strike, and the day wasn't over yet. The screen changed again. Gone were the spreadsheets, the cold emails, the surgical cruelty of budget reallocations. Now the image filling the chamber was warm and human, unbearably human. A young Marine, Michael Hayes, smiling with his wife, his arm around her shoulders. In his other arm, a newborn wrapped in a white blanket. The kind of photo you see in frames on mantels, the kind of smile you expect to last a lifetime. Then the second image appeared. Same child, years older, an oxygen mask covering most of their small face, a tangle of tubes running from the machine beside the bed. The photo didn't just land, it hollowed the air out of the room. Jasmine's voice returned, low and steady, but carrying an undertone that trembled just enough to show she wasn't reading from a script. While this family sold their truck to keep the lights on, millions meant for veterans' care were wired overseas. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't the silence of boredom or of politics as usual. It was the silence of a wound being reopened in public. In the front row, a veteran's grip tightened on his cane until his knuckles turned bone white. A woman beside him, also in uniform, blinked hard, swallowing against the weight in her chest. In Montana, the widow who had been watching all afternoon pressed her palm to her mouth. In Phoenix, a retired nurse turned away from the screen, but didn't leave the room. She couldn't. Trump shifted in his seat. For once, he didn't speak. The instinct to fill the void with his voice seemed to fight against the awareness that anything he said now might be remembered and replayed for the rest of his life. Jasmine didn't look at him. She clicked to the next slide. A scanned notice appeared on the massive monitor. Coverage revoked, stamped in red letters across the top of a VA benefits letter addressed to Michael Hayes. Her voice sharpened. Not loud, but tight, like a rope pulled until it sang. This is what arrived in their mailbox. At the same time, overseas accounts were swelling with cash taken from the Veterans Health Program. In the gallery, someone exhaled audibly, the sound breaking the brittle quiet. Jasmine stepped forward slightly, her shadow stretching across the polished floor toward the dais. While their son's oxygen supply was in question, while his parents took turns sleeping in a chair by his bed, you signed off on deals that line the pockets of people who will never see the inside of a VA hospital. Her gaze cut to the front row of veterans. No theatrics, no dramatics, just the steady acknowledgement that they were the reason she was saying every word. The camera caught one veteran nodding slowly, not in approval, but in grim recognition. In living rooms across the country, people leaned forward, not because they wanted drama, but because they could feel deep in their bones that they were hearing something that mattered. Trump leaned toward his microphone, but when his mouth opened, no words came out. Somewhere in Kansas, a factory worker watching on his phone muttered, "Yeah, that's what I thought." Jasmine clicked again. This time it wasn't documents or photographs. It was a single line from a bank record, a date, an amount, a transfer to a foreign investment account, exactly 3 days before the Hayes family's benefits were cut. The gasp that went through the chamber wasn't loud, but it was unified. A sharp inhale of realization. Jasmine didn't press the advantage with a raised voice or a pointed jab. She let the line sit there on the massive screen, the numbers glowing in cold white against a black background. Because she knew, in a country where numbers are currency, this was the number that would stick in people's heads. In New York, a cab driver watching on his phone at a red light whispered the number out loud, as though memorizing it for later. In Florida, a grandmother wrote it down on a notepad beside her couch. Back in the chamber, Trump finally found his voice. "This is a witch hunt. These so-called victims are props. I've done more for veterans than anyone." But he stopped when he saw the look on Jasmine's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disbelief. It was something colder, something that said, "You can't talk your way out of this." The veterans in the front row shifted again, their bodies angled toward Jasmine now, like they'd quietly chosen which side of the line they were standing on. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting earlier in the day. It wasn't just the weight of what she'd shown, it was the understanding, from everyone watching, that there was no way to bury it now. Jasmine glanced at the clock, then back at Trump. And in that measured moment, it became clear she still had more to say. The glow on the massive monitor shifted. Numbers now filled the screen, sharp white text against a deep navy backdrop. No speeches, no narration, just data. Independents, 82% siding with Jasmine Crockett. Veterans, 78% siding with Jasmine Crockett. Women, 81% siding with Jasmine Crockett. The figures hit the room harder than any insult or counterpunch could. For a man who had built his career on dominating polls, this wasn't just bad news. It was a public gut punch. Trump's eyes locked on the numbers, and for the first time all day, his expression didn't mask the blow. His shoulders dropped a fraction, his jaw tightened until the muscle jumped. The quiet in the room was no longer neutral. It had a shape now, the shape of power shifting hands. Somewhere in Ohio, a veteran sitting alone in his living room leaned back, exhaling slowly as if releasing years of pent-up frustration. In a Chicago diner, a waitress paused mid-order, eyes fixed on the TV bolted above the counter. Back in the chamber, Trump's hand gripped the edge of the table. The tendons in his wrist stood out like steel cables. Then suddenly, he shoved his chair back. The screech of its legs against the polished floor cut through the silence like a blade. Heads snapped toward him. Cameras pivoted, following his every movement. Without a word, he stood and adjusted his jacket with a jerky precision that betrayed more than he intended. For a man who thrived on the optics of control, this wasn't a power move. It was retreat. The heavy doors at the back of the chamber loomed like an escape route. He started toward them. Security shifted immediately, forming a loose ring that moved with him, their black suits cutting through the gallery like a tide. Every step he took was tracked, by camera lenses, by the collective gaze of the audience, and by millions watching live. Jasmine didn't move. She sat in her chair, hands folded loosely in front of her, eyes following him with the unblinking focus of someone who knew the power of staying still. One stayed, one walked, and America noticed. In living rooms across the country, people didn't need a commentator to tell them what they just witnessed. They saw it for themselves, the choice between standing in the storm and stepping away from it. In Texas, a veteran in a faded ball cap muttered to his wife, "He left before the fight was done." In Vermont, a retired school teacher texted her daughter, "You'll want to see this clip later." The doors swung open. A burst of hallway light spilled into the chamber before snapping shut again behind him. The echo of the closing doors rolled through the room, lingering like the aftershock of an earthquake. For a heartbeat, the space he'd left behind felt enormous. His chair sat empty, a physical reminder that he wasn't at the table anymore, literally or figuratively. Jasmine's gaze shifted to that empty chair. Not for long, just enough for the cameras to catch it. A look that said everything without a single word. One of us stayed. The murmurs in the gallery began to swell, a low tide turning into a wave. Veterans leaned toward one another, speaking in tones too quiet for the mics but not for the cameras. Up in the press box, reporters' fingers blurred over their keyboards. The headlines were already writing themselves. Trump walks out, mid-hearing Crockett holds ground. The moment the room shifted, the chairperson banged the gavel, trying to restore order, but the energy had changed permanently. The fortress, the illusion of unbreakable dominance, had cracked in plain sight. On the split screens of cable news broadcasts, viewers saw it side by side. On the left, Trump's back disappearing through the doorway. On the right, Jasmine seated, composed, eyes steady on the dais. The visual contrast spoke louder than any pundit could. In a small-town bar in Pennsylvania, a man watching the footage shook his head and muttered, "That's the clip they'll remember." At a bus stop in Los Angeles, two strangers huddled over a phone to watch the replay in real time. Inside the chamber, Jasmine finally leaned forward. Her voice, when it came, was even, measured. "Mr. Chair, I believe we still have work to do." It wasn't said for applause, it wasn't said for headlines. It was said because she understood something vital. When the fortress starts crumbling, you don't stop pressing until the walls are gone. That night, the phrase "truth over treason" burned across America, not in whispers, not in cautious conversations, but in paint, in light, in fire. On social media, the words appeared over and over, stamped across timelines, stitched into profile pictures, turned into bold graphics that spread faster than anyone could count. Someone in Detroit spray-painted it in 10-foot letters across an abandoned overpass. In Seattle, it covered the plywood of a boarded-up shop window, a defiant splash of white on black. By midnight, you could find it on murals, bumper stickers, and handwritten cardboard signs propped in apartment windows. At a Texas VFW hall, the night's regular pool game stopped. Veterans in worn caps and faded jackets gathered around a corner table. One man, his hair gone to silver, his voice steady, raised his glass. "For her!" The others followed. The clink of glass rang out like a pledge. In Los Angeles, the bells of St. Mary's rang out at 9 p.m. Inside, the pews glowed with candlelight. Men and women sat shoulder to shoulder, strangers united by something they couldn't quite name, only feel. A banner hung across the altar steps, "Truth over treason." This was no longer a hearing, it was a movement. In kitchens, people who never watched political hearings were replaying clips on their phones. In small-town diners, TVs that usually showed weather or football highlights stayed locked on news coverage. Even the anchors had changed their tone. "This wasn't just testimony," one said. "This was a fracture line in the country's political bedrock." In Montana, the widow with the folded flag didn't just watch. She printed the words "Truth over treason" in bold black letters and taped them to her front window. When her neighbor saw it the next morning, he did the same. By afternoon, the street looked like it had been dressed for a parade. In Boston, a group of college students projected the phrase onto the side of a skyscraper. The letters towering above the city lights. Cars honked as they passed. Someone shouted from the street below, For Jasmine! Meanwhile, clips from the hearing flooded every corner of the internet. The still frame of Trump walking out, head turned slightly, jaw tight, appeared beside Jasmine's calm, steady posture. Memes, short videos, even watercolor portraits popped up, each capturing the same moment. One stayed, one walked. In Washington, staffers worked late into the night, phones pressed to ears trying to calculate the fallout. Leaked text messages from aides on both sides hinted at what everyone already suspected. The damage was real, and it wasn't stopping. News programs replayed Caleb Morton's words on a loop. I was in the room. I heard the calls. I saw the signatures. Everything you've seen is real. Each replay chipped away further at whatever was left of the fortress. In a Nashville bar, a veteran leaned over to his friend. You hear that? He didn't just bring receipts. He brought the whole damn ledger. By dawn the next morning, rallies had sprung up in over a dozen cities. Some were small, a few dozen people holding signs in the rain. Others filled entire public squares, crowds chanting, voices echoing between buildings. In Philadelphia, a retired firefighter held his granddaughter on his shoulders as they marched, her small hands gripping a cardboard sign twice her size. In Miami, church choirs sang hymns between speeches, their voices carrying over the crowd like a wave. The power of the movement wasn't in one city or one crowd or one clip. It was in the way the phrase crossed lines people thought couldn't be crossed. Political, generational, cultural. Because truth over treason wasn't about parties anymore. It was about choosing a side between right and wrong. Cable news captured the scale with aerial shots. Rivers of people moving through city streets, signs bobbing, chants rolling like thunder. One veteran in New York held a sign that read, I fought for this flag. I'll fight for the truth too. Inside the chamber, the hearing wasn't over. But outside, it had already transformed into something no one could contain. Reporters began calling it the fire. Not a scandal, not an event, a fire. One that started in a single room, then moved through screens, streets, and hearts faster than anyone expected. And somewhere in the quiet of her office, Jasmine Crockett saw the images on her phone. The murals, the vigils, the crowds. She didn't smile. Not yet, because she knew movements are only as strong as what comes next. And the walls weren't all down. Not yet. By sunrise, her face was everywhere. Not mid-speech, not mid-gesture. Still. Morning shows replayed that stillness like it was game footage. One segment slowed the clip frame by frame. The moment Trump stood, the empty chair he left behind, and her unflinching eyes holding the space like a sentry. A retired general, his ribbons filling half his chest, leaned forward in a studio chair. That's what you call holding the high ground, he said. You don't rush. You don't flinch. You make the other side spend their energy while you conserve yours. Psychologists on another network called it non-reactive dominance, a rare ability to project control not by force, but by refusing to surrender emotional footing. But in small towns and big cities, ordinary Americans didn't need a clinical term. They called it what it was, courage. In a barbershop in Cleveland, a man pointed to the TV and said, "That right there, that's how you beat a bully." In a rural Georgia diner, a waitress poured coffee for a table of veterans, all of them nodding as they watched the replay in silence. In Los Angeles, a muralist had already painted her profile on the side of a brick building. The line of her jaw sharp, the background split into two colors, black on one side, white on the other. Across the bottom, in bold red, truth over treason. It wasn't just what she had said, it was how she'd said it. Or more precisely, how she had chosen not to say more than necessary. The stillness had weight. It told the world she wasn't performing. She was holding ground. In a newsroom in New York, an editor played the clip without audio for a colleague. "Watch this," he said. "You don't even need the sound. You can feel who's winning." That day, stills from the hearing became the most shared images online. One showed her seated, hands loosely folded, eyes level. Another caught the empty chair across from her, the one Trump had left behind. They became visual shorthand for the hearing, for the movement, for the fight itself. In Kansas, a farmer taped one of those images to the inside of his barn door. In Miami, a shop owner printed it on the front page of her store flyer. By noon, newspapers had given it names. The stare, the hold, the moment. Cable news panels debated the strategy. Was it calculated? Was it instinct? Did she train for this? Or is this just who she is? The answer didn't matter to the people watching from home. What mattered was that it was rare, and it was working. Jasmine didn't watch the coverage. While the country analyzed her composure, she sat in a quiet office reviewing her notes for the next round. A staffer stepped in, phone in hand. "You've seen the polls?" She nodded. She didn't ask for the numbers. She already knew the momentum was building. Her stillness had done more than hold ground. It had given the public time to choose sides, and they had. In Chicago, a group of law students skipped class to gather in the quad, laptops open, streaming the hearing. One of them said, "It's not even about politics anymore. It's about the fact that she's not afraid." Fearless was the word people kept coming back to. Even those who disagreed with her politics found themselves saying it. In a VFW hall in North Carolina, a man who had voted Republican his entire life muttered to the table, "I don't care who she runs against. If she's on the ballot, I'm with her." The thing about stillness, Jasmine knew, was that it's never truly still. It's a coil. It's a bowstring. It's the held breath before the strike. And she was coiled. The evidence she had revealed so far was devastating. But the next piece, the one she was saving, wouldn't just wound. It would collapse the last remaining wall. On the networks, talking heads speculated about what else she might have. Some said she was bluffing. Others warned that the worst was yet to come. The truth was simpler. She had it, and she knew exactly when to use it. That afternoon, her team received word that rallies were scheduled in 38 cities over the weekend. Crowds were already forming in front of federal buildings, chanting the phrase that had lit the country on fire: "Truth over treason." From her office window, she could see one of those gatherings spilling into the street, handmade signs bobbing above the crowd, horns honking in support. Jasmine closed her folder. Stillness had carried her this far. Now it was time to move. Under a purple twilight sky, the National Mall was a living ocean of people. The monuments stood like silent witnesses, their stone faces bathed in the glow of 1,000 cell phone lights held high. From the steps of the stage, Jasmine Crockett looked out over the crowd, not as a politician, not as a headline, but as someone who had stepped into a fight and refused to step back. Her voice carried, not because she shouted, but because the night itself seemed to lean in to listen. When truth is called treason, patriots must speak louder. The response was instant. A rolling roar surged forward and back, washing over the length of the mall. Veterans in faded caps raised their hands. Farmers in work boots stamped their heels into the grass. Nurses, still in their scrubs, waved signs they'd made on the backs of hospital charts. "This isn't about left or right," she continued. "This is about keeping promises." The words landed like hammers striking the same stone, again and again. Promises to serve, promises to protect. Promises not just written in law, but carved into the moral bedrock of the country. In the front rows, a group of Gold Star families stood together, flags folded neatly in their arms. Their faces were lit by the glow of the big screen, their eyes fixed on her. They weren't here for theater. They were here for truth. Jasmine stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her heels sinking slightly into the wood. "They told us that veterans' lives could be bargained away. They told us that the truth didn't matter if the lie was loud enough. But we are here tonight to say, the lie ends now." The chant began somewhere near the center of the crowd. Low at first, then growing, swelling. "Truth over treason. Truth over treason." It rolled forward like a wave breaking, until it was impossible to tell where it started. Only that it was everywhere. On the big screen behind her, images began to flash. Michael Hayes holding his newborn. The oxygen mask years later. The red-stamped coverage revoked letter. Caleb Morton sliding the stack of damning documents across the table. Each image drew another surge from the crowd. Not just anger, resolve. Jasmine let them see it all. Then she raised her hand and the chant faded. Her next words were slower, measured, each one hitting like the strike of a gavel. "I told you the second strike wasn't the end. I told you there was more." She turned to the screen. A new image appeared. A bank transfer. Dated, signed, approved. But this one was different. It wasn't just linked to stolen funds. It was linked directly to a personal account. And under the signature, in unmistakable handwriting, Donald J. Trump. The sound that went through the mall wasn't a cheer. It wasn't a gasp. It was the sound of thousands of people taking in the same breath at once. The moment before a crowd decides it will never go back to being quiet. Somewhere in the middle rows, a veteran in a wheelchair raised his fist high. Beside him, his daughter began to cry. Jasmine's voice cut through the air again. This is not politics. This is theft. This is betrayal. And it happened under the flag our families fought to defend. A woman near the stage shouted, "Not anymore!" The crowd picked it up instantly. "Not anymore! Not anymore!" News drones floated above, their blinking lights capturing the scope of the gathering. The kind of crowd that makes history, the kind that writes it in the open air for everyone to see. Far beyond the mall, in living rooms, bars, and quiet bedrooms, Americans watched on screens and felt the same thing. This wasn't just a rally, it was a reckoning. She closed the folder in her hands. No more documents tonight. The evidence had been given. The movement had begun. Now came the part that couldn't be printed or signed. It had to be lived. We will not let this be forgotten. We will not be silenced, and we will not let one man's greed decide the worth of our service members' lives. The purple twilight had deepened into night. The floodlights around the mall cast the crowd in gold. Faces bright, signs lifted high, voices carrying into the dark like a promise. History wasn't just being written, it was being burned into stone. In the end, it wasn't the documents, the headlines, or the chants that endured. It was the reminder that truth once spoken cannot be unspoken. A single voice, steady in the storm, can awaken thousands who thought they had no power left. We are measured not by the comfort we keep, but by the promises we protect, especially when keeping them costs us something. And in that choice, we decide the kind of nation and the kind of people we become. If this story lit a spark in you, don't just move on, hold it, share it. Let it breathe in the conversations that matter, like comment and send it to someone who knows promises to our veterans are not bargaining chips. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where truth stands its ground and no betrayal hides in the shadows. Hit the bell, because the next chapter isn't quiet, it's fierce, and it might change the way you see loyalty, service, and justice. And this is a fictional dramatization, born from echoes of real courage and real wrongs. Any resemblance to people or events is coincidental, or a mirror held up for us all to see. Thank you for watching. Justice isn't a gift. It's a fight we choose together. This is Harrison Stories.